Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our Women on Wednesdays series. We're glad that you are here with us this evening. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and campaign training. We facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and leadership. And tonight we have a special program under the umbrella of our Gender on the Ballot project, which we started back in 2019 as a partnership with the nonpartisan Barbara Lee Family Foundation. And thanks to Barbara's support and generosity, the project is continuing under WPI. So with the 2024 election just 26 days away and the very real prospect of electing the first female president, we wanted to take an in-depth look at women voters to try to understand who they're supporting and why, what issues are most important to them when casting their ballots, and how they think about the economy, reproductive rights, and women's leadership in politics. And so just as we've done annually for the past few years, we have teamed up with our friends at the Benenson Strategy Group to put together a comprehensive poll that seeks answers to our many questions. And because we've asked the same questions for the past few years, at least many of the same questions, we're able to really assess how issues and attitudes may have changed over time. And the result is our new research report entitled She Votes: From Issues to Impact. And we're fortunate to have a great panel here with us that includes our lead pollster on the project, Lindsay Vermeyen of Benenson Strategy Group, Amanda Hunter, our Gender on the Ballot partner, who was the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation before they sunset their operations a few months ago. And finally, Elena Schneider, a national political reporter with Politico, who reported on our poll last Friday and who's been covering this historical campaign. So we're delighted they could all join us this evening. We have a lot of fascinating data to go through. We're going to divide the data review and discussion into 4 parts. We'll first talk about the all-important presidential race, the horse race, who's up, favorability, all that good stuff. Then we'll dive deeper into the current economic landscape, as well as the issue of reproductive rights. And finally, we'll discuss women's political engagement and political leadership. And I will monitor the Q&A and take questions throughout and also at the end. So as we go along, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So with that, Lindsay, I will turn it over to you to kick it off with the presidential matchup results between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Excellent. We are going to ground our discussion today in the data. So I will be sharing a few data slides for each of the sections that Betsy outlined. So first, just as a reminder for those of you who haven't read the poll, this was a survey conducted with over 800 women who are registered voters at the end of September. So all the data that you see in this presentation is from this survey of women or from previous years' surveys of women who are registered voters. All right, starting off with the presidential numbers. Now, with women, Harris has seen a huge jump in her favorability, and we've seen this in polls across swing states and with registered voters overall. But since becoming the top of the ticket, with women in particular, we have seen her numbers jump 12 points since last year in terms of the margin who are favorable for her. 55% of women are favorable to the vice president right now, 41% are unfavorable. Now, if you look down at President Joe Biden's numbers, he's underwater with 44% favorable, 51% unfavorable, and his favorability has dropped since last year. Former President Donald Trump is also underwater with just 40% favorable and 57% unfavorable. With independent women in particular, we wanted to call out that Vice President Harris has seen an even larger jump. 51% of independent women tell us they are favorable to the vice president, 38% are unfavorable. That's a 23-point jump in favorability just since last year. In terms of the horse race itself, right now, Kamala Harris enjoys a 15-point advantage over Donald Trump with women. And that is both in terms of who women tell us they will vote for, as well as who they think will win. On the right side of this slide, you'll see we have 50% of women who tell us they believe that Kamala Harris will win the election, and 35% who believe Donald Trump will win. Now, in terms of who they're voting for themselves, 54% tell us they will vote for Kamala Harris, 39% tell us they will vote for Donald Trump. Unsurprisingly, this is heavily partisan. 94% of Democratic women tell us they're voting for Harris. 50% of independent women tell us they are voting for Kamala Harris. When it comes to the issues and who women trust on issues, far and away on nearly every issue we asked about, women trust Harris and her running mate, Tim Walz, considerably more than they trust Donald Trump and JD Vance. If you look at the top issue here, addressing the issue of abortion, Kamala Harris has a 28-point advantage over Donald Trump. Addressing inflation and the high cost of gas and groceries and basics, she has a 14-point advantage, 51% trust Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, just 37% trust Trump and Vance. Even on the economy generally, an area that we often see Democrats struggle, 46% of women tell us they trust Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, just 38% trust Trump and Vance more to deal with the economy. And on immigration, which it has Kamala Harris's lowest margin of advantage, we are still up here. Kamala Harris is up 44% to 40% who would trust Trump and Vance. Moving on from issues now to more characteristics, to qualities, to attributes of a leader that they're looking for. Women continue to trust Harris and Walz across the board to look out for them, to put the needs of working families first, to care about people like you, to be a strong leader. Now, certainly as we get into who they trust to tell the truth, there we see some more uncertainty, more folks who say that they trust neither candidate, but by and large, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have a huge advantage on these character qualities and attributes over Trump and Vance. And then finally, for this section, before we get into talking to our panel, we asked women whether they support Donald Trump's policies and like his leadership style, whether they support his policies but dislike his leadership style, or whether they don't support his policies or his leadership style. Resoundingly, women disapprove of Trump's leadership style. We do have about a quarter of younger voters under 50, and parents of young children, a lot of crossover there, of course, who do support his policies, even if they don't support his leadership style. But the majority of women, 54%, do not support his policies or his leadership style.
That's great, Lindsay. Thanks. Could you go back to the issues slide? Because I want to ask Amanda and Elena about the advantage that Kamala Harris has on the economy and the issue of handling of inflation, despite the current economic environment. And Amanda, does that surprise you?
I was really surprised to see that, because we've historically found in our work at the foundation that women and Democrats tend to be weaker on the economy. And so Democratic women have a double weakness. And so to see such strong numbers was really striking, and I think says a lot about what women voters have lived through over the last few years.
Elena, what do you make of that and attribute that to?
Yeah, I've asked a lot of folks on Kamala Harris's campaign and then Democrats who are watching this about why she has been able to show some breakage here, basically, from Joe Biden's poor numbers on the economy. So much of what we know was dragging down his campaign obviously his age and people's perceptions of him being too old. But I would put a close second to that is the cost of living and the inflation
Right.
that he presided over the last several years. And yet, even though she was a part of his administration and then also was a part of people, or during the time when costs really started to rise, for whatever reason, voters are not necessarily tying her to that. There seems to be some sort of a breakage here where they're able to distinguish these two things. And that's really important if Kamala Harris wants to continue to try and tell voters that she's going to be a change candidate, that they can trust her to provide something different on the economy, that she has to really solidify this idea that she's going to be somewhat different than Joe Biden on the economy. And so to see that opening there was really notable, because we know that for Democrats broadly, but also for Kamala Harris specifically, her weakness or voters, not being as trusting of Democrats on economic issues is really important and could very well decide this election.
Do you think, though, that she needs to offer some more specifics on solutions? I was noting in particular, in the 60 Minutes interview where she really couldn't say, how she was going to pay for some of the proposals. Do you think that's kind of a tricky area for her?
I think that Democrats are sort of two minds of this. I think that there are some who think that she really does need to offer more specific ideas around this and would like her to focus more on what she's going to do for Social Security and Medicare, or give some more specifics. And she's done some of that, right? Like, she has talked about some of the tax breaks that she'd be giving to families who have new babies, first-time home buyers. She's offered some, but to your point, she's been incredibly light on the details of how she actually plans to pay for any of these proposals, other than to vaguely just say she wants to tax, to make sure that billionaires pay their fair share.
Pay their fair share, right?
Exactly. And so I think that for other Democrats, and I think those inside her campaign, there's more of a sense of, let's campaign in poetry and deal with the pros of governing later. And let's just hope that people, will believe her when they say she will figure this out, because, it's not helpful to get into the nitty-gritty details in the middle of a campaign.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Betsy, we found in our research too that voters do want specifics when it comes to having an economic plan. But then if you have too many facts and figures or too many specifics, they feel overwhelmed and bogged down. So I would imagine she's probably trying to walk that line, and after coming in so late to the race too, trying to catch up on that stuff. Yeah,
that makes sense. Do you all think on the issue of immigration, I was kind of surprised. I mean, obviously it's not as strong as some of the other issues, but it certainly is an issue that Trump has made sort of a cornerstone of his campaigns, plural, over the last 8 years. Lindsay, maybe I'll ask you, just from a polling perspective, do you think she has an advantage there just simply because she's got a gulf of an advantage among women anyway, and that just shows up in this respect as well?
I think that's right. I mean, she only has a 4-point advantage here, and considering her vote share has a 15-point advantage, there is a significant disconnect on this issue. Obviously, immigration is a huge issue for Republicans, regardless of gender, but it's also a big issue for independents as well. And I think, given what we've seen the current Democratic administration also trying to do on immigration, they know it's an issue that they have to also address in a way that more conservative voters might appreciate.
Yeah. So you mentioned independents. Maybe go back to like the independent slide we have, or the horse race slide with independent women, because Elena, I wanted to ask you, the 18 plus she has among independent women, the strong favorabilities among independent women, increasing so much even from last year. How important is that to her strategy of trying to appeal to, independent women, Republican-leaning women, who may be a little bit who will be up for grabs, and in many cases will probably play a significant role in deciding who's going to win in November?
I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask a pollster, who is the demographic group that's going to be most, who will look back on after election day and say, that was the group that helped her win it. But I think a lot of people would say independent women over 50 could play to, and again, it's hard to sort of then declare the winner of who's the most important. But I do think that group in particular is, and I would even add to that, non-college women over 50
Yeah.
are a group where she has a real ability to grow, in part because of their concern about abortion. You know, I was out with a state Senate candidate back in 2022 in Macomb County, Michigan. This is used to be ground zero for Republican Trump support. And it's certainly not turning blue anytime soon, but there were so many women whose doors we knocked on who talked about their concerns about abortion. Remember back, this was Michigan, the gubernatorial race between Gretchen Whitmer and Tudor Dixon. There was a ballot initiative to try and enshrine that, you know, abortion rights into the state constitution. And I heard over and over again, women say, I'm pro-life. I would not get an abortion, but I think that this has gone too far. And those are exactly sort of the independent women, people who don't necessarily feel really strongly about one party or the other. Those are the kinds of people where she has room to grow. And when
Yeah.
you're thinking about sort of that very narrow slice of the electorate that can actually be persuaded, I think that to have those favorability numbers has got to make the Harris campaign feel at least a little bit better about their ability to bring those people over.
Yeah, that makes sense. Lindsay, let me ask you, because we have a question in the chat about this from Peter Keating, who says, how much of the improvement would you say is attributed to Kamala Harris as leader of the campaign versus her running mate?
Versus Tim Walz?
Like,
Well,
I think, you know, does adding Walz to the ticket, is that did that spur her, you know, jump in favorability ratings?
Sure. I mean, thinking generally about the polls that we've seen since
Yeah.
Kamala Harris entered the race, there wasn't a huge bump when Tim Walz entered the conversation. He certainly hasn't hurt the campaign in any way. I think he appeals to a lot of folks that folks might have been worried about losing from the Joe Biden coalition, though we didn't see much risk of that between when Kamala Harris entered the race and when she selected a running mate, at least from the polls that were released.
Peter is clarifying his question. He actually meant versus her as Joe Biden's running mate. In other words, her becoming the pick, you know, isn't that a natural that we're going to see such an increase? Obviously, she's gone from, you know, the running mate to the actual, you know, candidate.
Yeah, I think it's a huge testament to Democrats' ability to rally around her when she became top of the ticket. I know as a Democrat, there was a lot of uncertainty in that sort of 12 to 24 hours period after Joe Biden dropped out. And I think it really speaks to how nervous we had been with Joe Biden as the candidate, and how happy people were to have a change. We have seen in polling that people do think of her as a change. Somehow, as Elena mentioned, and as Amanda have mentioned, she has been unburdened by what this administration has experienced and presided over in a lot of ways that we might not expect a candidate who had been in this race from the beginning, at least, to enjoy.
Well, and I also remember during the primaries when Nikki Haley was running, one of her taglines in every event was, you know, a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Kamala Harris, as if that was the worst possible thing you could do. So that's changed a lot as well. Before we move on, though, I did want to mention that trust number on one of the, I think it was maybe slide 8. That 22%, because I think it might be a little bit relevant in our discussions in the last few days over sort of misinformation around FEMA and hurricane preparedness, that, you know, there's still, you know, a large number of voters who really don't trust either side. Was that striking to anybody?
I can chime in. It doesn't surprise me so much as, you know, continues a string of increased distrust coming out of 2016, coming out of the pandemic. Just people do not have a lot of faith in government institutions, or the same faith they have in government institutions that they once did.
Yeah. Okay, you want to take us through our next section?
Absolutely. All right, we're going to talk a bit about the economic landscape now. So certainly, I think it's probably no surprise to folks who are listening to this. There is a lot of anxiety about the current state of the country. We have seen a 9-point increase in those who describe how they feel about how things are going in the US right now as being anxious or worried. 56% of women use anxious or worried to describe their feelings about the country right now. At the same time, we've also seen an almost equal increase in the number who say they're hopeful. More than a quarter, almost a third of folks, of women tell us that they feel hopeful about how things are going in the US right now. And I think we can attribute part of that to the potential change that we're going to see in the next month or so. Inflation still certainly dominates the mindset in terms of the issues they care about as they're making their decisions in this election. But we also see, compared to the past 2 years of data, which we have on this slide, that women are more focused on abortion as well as immigration than they have been. Inflation has dominated the mindset for the past 3 years, but abortion, more than a third of women say it's one of the most important issues that they consider when they're deciding who to vote for. And a similar number talk about immigration and border security as one of the most important issues as they're deciding their vote. And those have both increased by quite a bit over the past year and even 2 years. Now, we've talked about how inflation is still very relevant to the conversation, but at the same time, we actually have less pessimism about the economy than we have seen over the past 2 years. 45% of women tell us they are pessimistic about the economy this year, which, don't get me wrong, 45% of women being pessimistic about the economy is still a lot of people feeling very pessimistic. But that number was 60% last year. We've seen the biggest drops with women in the suburbs and women over 50 who are significantly less pessimistic than they have been in recent years. And that's despite them personally feeling like their own financial situations have sharply worsened. Now, I think with the inflation we've experienced over the past year and the perceptions that continue to exist about it, this is something that people feel in their pocketbooks. 64% of women say that their personal financial situation has gotten worse over the last few years. That is particularly high with folks who are independents and Republicans, with parents of grown children, and in the Southern and Midwest parts of the country. I'll pause there if we want to get into some discussion.
Elena, let me ask you, because I was thinking about sort of the policy, the new policy proposal that Kamala Harris came out with, I guess yesterday, about Medicare and and covering caregiving in Medicare. And to me, that spoke to sort of the sandwich generation, probably a lot of these women, right, who just are dealing with childcare costs, but also dealing with caring for an elderly parent. Do you think strategically that she's trying to address kind of the sentiment that we're seeing in the poll here?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that she is trying to talk about a group that has often been left out of these discussions. Often this kind of care work hasn't traditionally been considered something that we would pay for, but obviously it is a huge burden on families, and it is a huge part of what costs factor into how people put together their decision to stay in the workforce or the need to stay home. We're also, importantly, one of the few industrialized countries that still doesn't offer paid family leave. So she's really touching on a whole number of things that in some ways are still sort of shocking that we as a country haven't quite figured out an answer for. But I think that it's part of sort of a broader conversation about, I think, that she's tapping into about the treatment of women in this country. And I think being able to lean into that by talking about it policy-wise, but being able to, even in her interviews when she talked about it on The View, acknowledging some of the financial and emotional and physical burdens that go into the care economy. I think that connects with voters in a way that they feel heard, and she can sort of provide a bit of that empathetic, like, I hear you, this has been really hard, this is not an easy time, I'm feeling, responding to some of the pessimism, even as, this poll says it has improved slightly. able to respond to some of that frustration around the economy in a way that doesn't necessarily remind people that she was a part of the administration that presided over some of that, but nonetheless, she feels it. And I think that that is a really powerful way to talk about some of these economic issues.
Amanda, do you have any observations on this economy section you want to address?
No, I mean, I think it's fascinating that she's sort of caught up to voters who have been saying for a while that this is not a women's issue, that this is
Right.
an economic and a family issue. And I think that's very refreshing for all of the same voters that are saying that they're feeling the squeeze economically.
Yeah. I do want to touch on one of the abortion questions in there, but why don't, Lindsay, you go ahead with the next section on abortion, and we'll talk more about that afterwards.
Great. All right. The vast majority of women continue to tell us that abortion should be available and not limited by the government. When we ask them if they personally support a person's right to abortion and believe it should be legal and available, or if they personally are against abortion but don't think government should prevent someone from making that decision for themselves, or if they believe that having an abortion is wrong and should be illegal, just 14% choose that latter category. 50% personally support the right, and another 36% personally are against abortion, but don't think the government should be interfering with that. As you'll see across the board in terms of major demographics, strong majorities of women do not want the government involved in abortion. Additionally, when we look at this in terms of whether they think abortion should be legal or illegal, women continue to overwhelmingly believe abortion should be legal in at least most cases. The darker green bar is the percent who believe it should be legal in all cases, 29% overall. Another 38% who believe it should be legal in most cases with some restrictions. 27% believe it should be illegal except in exceptions like rape and incest, and just 7% believe it should be illegal in all circumstances. Now, some of the notable numbers that we've seen change over the past year with Republican women, we've seen a 12-point drop in the percent who believe abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. Additionally, with Black women, we've seen a 10-point drop in the percent who tell us it should be illegal in all circumstances. And I think if for those who are in swing states, who are in states that have abortion measures on the ballot this year, this won't surprise you at all. It is all over the airwaves in so many states, even in swing states where there's no abortion measure on the ballot. I know lots of the candidates, candidates up and down the ticket are using abortion as a messaging tool to signal their values. We also asked women whether they believed it was important for birth control and for IVF to be available and affordable to anyone who needs it. As you'll see here, almost nearly universally, there's a desire among women to protect access to birth control, and strong majorities who want to protect access to IVF and fertility treatments. 57% who say it's very important for IVF to be available and affordable to anyone who needs it. 84% who say it's at least somewhat important. These are really high numbers. We see support numbers like this for things like apple pie. Like this is something that everybody wants. And then finally, before we talk a bit about abortion and reproductive rights, abortion is a motivating issue for women this year. We saw it was a motivating issue in 2022, and I think it's going to be the same this year. Among most demographic groups, a majority of women tell us they would at least be somewhat more motivated to go vote in November, with more than a third telling us they're much more motivated to vote. 54% of Democratic women tell us they're much more motivated to vote, given the current state of abortion rights, and they'll get out to the polls in November because of it.
Great. Elena, I know you've done a lot of reporting on this issue, especially sort of on the motivating factor and how the campaign is really trying to, we saw this during the convention, highlight women who have had to go through the process. We've seen Democratic ads run about it. How much is the campaign, do you think, in these final couple of weeks going to continue to really talk about this issue?
Well, I think we can expect that abortion is going to play a major, if not the major dominant theme in TV ads and digital ads through the end of the election, which is remarkable and unprecedented because up until 2022, Democrats basically never talked about abortion in TV ads or in digital ads. In fact, it was the other side. It was Republicans that would talk about it because it was a motivating issue for their side. And for the Democratic side, we're, like I said, we're seeing the reverse right now because of Roe versus Wade getting overturned. This is our first presidential cycle in which women are living under that new reality. And part of making that new reality clear to women voters is how they communicate what has changed. And part of what makes that challenging is that each state is different. So how these new abortion restrictions are affecting voters vary depending on the state. And it's been really interesting to watch the campaign try to navigate that. But what's clear is that they're trying to lean into women and stories of regular women who have had experiences with abortion that you wouldn't necessarily expect or wasn't necessarily in the traditional concept of how Republicans would talk about the use of abortion. We're hearing about ectopic pregnancies. We're hearing about ruptured uteruses. We're hearing about very wanted pregnancies in which a fetal anomaly means that a woman has to get an abortion at 20 weeks, a baby who they've named, a baby who they've decorated a nursery for. And those are, understandings or concepts of abortion that I don't think a lot of voters necessarily connected with an abortion or would have thought of in their own mind as abortion care. And so part of this has just been an education exercise of explaining to voters what this actually means in terms of women's lives. And it's proven to be incredibly powerful. I spoke with, arguably the first person to really lean into this as a way to communicate in ads was Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky. And he won that governor's race, and he cited Hadley Duvall, the woman who went direct to camera to talk about her experiences in being raped by her stepfather. And part of that was because in Kentucky, they do not have exceptions for rape and incest. And so they were able to lean into this incredibly horrific story of this young woman. And the people who it moved, according to Beshear's campaign manager, was not necessarily women, but it changed the minds of older rural men. Because I think for them, they literally hadn't thought about this as what this would mean or how this could affect their daughters or their grandchildren. So all this to say is that this has proven to be a really potent issue. And I think what the challenge for the Harris campaign is going to be is how can you connect something like abortion in which the restrictions are different in every single state, every woman's experience of it is different. How do you connect that with a candidate? Because we've seen in these ballot initiatives in Ohio and in Kansas, it's clear that a majority of voters do not support bans on abortion, that they're sort of far more in favor of sort of a traditional reading of abortion and reproductive rights access. But that's an up and down vote on abortion rights. That doesn't necessarily take the next step of connecting that issue to a candidate. And that is going to be the big hurdle for Kamala Harris, is making sure that voters understand that if they care about abortion, then they have to actually vote for a Democrat, which for some women might be challenging.
Right. Well, Lindsay, let me ask you about that point of the power of storytelling, because in the poll, we saw even among Republican women that opposition to abortion rights has softened significantly from last year.
Absolutely. And I've worked with several different campaigns on abortion right issues, and we consistently see the power of personal storytellers to be incredible. And it works, to Elena's point, not just with women on the right, but with men who have not thought about this, or men who go back and think about their own wives' experiences and say, oh yeah, like what we did need to have, like we needed to have an abortion. Didn't think about it as an abortion. I thought about it as taking care of a miscarriage or what have you. But it does certainly soften those views. We've also seen men talking about their own journeys with this decision to be really powerful as a different version of that storyteller too.
Great. Well, let's move on to some of the fun stuff in the poll about engagement and then, of course, women in leadership.
Great. All right. In a very turbulent election cycle, there has been an increase in interest in politics for women. But that is true for both younger and older women alike. We've seen a 14-point increase in the number of women under age 35 who tell us that their interest in political issues has increased, an 11-point increase for women over 65 who tell us in the past few years their interest in political issues has increased. It's clear that the stakes are high in this election. More than 8 in 10 believe that the election will be more important than most, which was a significant increase from the number who said it would be just last year when we asked them. We have 48%, nearly half, who say this will be the most important election of their lifetime so far. More than half of Democratic women and just under half of Republican women. With seemingly constant breaking news, our engagement numbers, the percent of people who say they've been more engaged with and tuned into politics than they usually are because of everything that's going on, are up across the board. 9 points overall of people say they are more engaged since last year. That is up 14 points with parents of older children, up 14 points with Democrats, and up 12 points with women who are 50 plus. In terms of their views and women in leadership, not more than 9 in 10 Democratic women are excited to elect the country's first female president. 91% of Democratic women tell us they agree that the gender of the president doesn't matter. That it would be exciting to help make history by electing America's first female president. Those labels are switched there. And that's more than half overall, nearly 2/3 overall, who tell us that it would be exciting to help make history by electing America's first female president. A majority of Democrats and independents believe that electing Harris will open the door for more female politicians in the future. 63% overall agree that electing Kamala Harris as our first female president will open the door for more women to run for office and get elected, including 93% of Democrats and 60% of independents who agree with that statement. And most women, 60%, continue to feel that there are too few women in office currently. That's 80% of Democratic women who believe there are too few women in office, and 63% of independent women. 31% of Republican women also believe there are too few women in elected office. The plurality of them agree that there's about the right number right now. Women also believe it's important to elect more women to political office, and the country is more open to a woman president than it was 8 years ago in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran. 71% overall tell us that it is at least somewhat important to elect more women to political office. It includes 89% of Democratic women, 71% of independent women, 46% of Republican women. Overall, 68% agree that the country is more open to a woman president today than it was 8 years ago when Hillary Clinton ran, including 86% of Democrats and 65% of independent women. Finally, we did ask whether if they personally know someone who wouldn't vote for a woman for president. 1 in 10 actually tell us that they themselves would not vote for a woman for president, but up to 4 in 10 know someone who would not. And that includes women sort of across the board who know someone personally, whether a friend or family member, who wouldn't vote for a woman president.
Thanks, Lindy. And let me just pick up on that last one first. Just from a polling perspective, why is that question important, and what do we get out of that kind of a question?
Sure. Obviously, a lot of the data in here has been very exciting for those of us who are looking to promote equality in politics and more women in politics. But we really wanted to stress test and see, despite the fact that the women believe the country is more open, do they actually think the people around them are more open? Do they think the people around them still have these inherent biases? And that answer clearly is yes.
Interesting. Amanda, I know you all at the Barberly Family Foundation done a lot of research into this very issue. Talk about some of those stereotypes that we still see about women in executive office.
Sure. And I think this question in particular really comes down to people's concerns about electability, which really pushes up against so many of the stereotypes that we've seen. And when Barbara started the foundation more than 25 years ago, it was because she realized that women face additional barriers when seeking executive office. And we've seen it all play out in this campaign, even when Nikki Haley was in the race, that voters need more evidence that women are experienced enough and qualified. And I think even in the criticism that we're hearing about the vice president isn't giving enough details or people don't know her, I don't think that they would say some of those same things if she were a man, if she looked the part. But what we found is that some voters can have what we call an imagination barrier when it comes to picturing women at the highest levels of office. And if you look, sound, and act like Mike Pence, people were less likely to ask, what's he doing every day? What's he working on? I don't think a lot of people could tell you off the top of their head what policy issues he was in charge of. And that wasn't a problem for them. But because she looks, sounds, and acts different, it trips some people up and it brings up a lot of those biases. And aside from scrutinizing her laugh and some of the more sexist things that we've seen overtly, I think that some of the criticism around she's not serious enough in her numbers on the economy or she's not strong enough to deal with immigration are very gendered, and we're always watching those trends. And we saw the same with Nikki Haley, people saying that they needed more details or she wasn't electable or qualified.
Elena, I was thinking about just the other day when the firefighters union just decided not to do an endorsement. Obviously male heavy group like that, and the Teamsters as well. I've kind of thought about this manifesting itself. Did that jump out at you as well? And have you seen this in other ways on the campaign trail?
Yeah, I certainly, and I had the same thought when they decided against endorsing as well. Look, I covered Kirsten Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, all during the 2020 campaign, and that was a historic and obviously Kamala Harris. That was a historic primary in which we saw again a historic number of incredibly qualified women run for president. And, taking us back to Iowa 2020, part of the big discussion then was Bernie Sanders, whether he had told whether he had told Elizabeth Warren that a woman could beat Trump. And that was sort of the central argument. And it was something that you'd hear, whispered among voters, whispered among staffers, and at a certain point, finally out and out talked about, particularly by Senator Amy Klobuchar, of just simply saying that this is still a really challenging hurdle for women running for office, in part because we have so few examples of it even further down the ballot. I mean, in the entire course of American history, only 3% of America's governors have ever been women. And we've seen huge strides I shouldn't say huge strides, but not insignificant strides with women in legislative positions. And I think that there are some really interesting research that's been done about the differences between electing women to a legislative body versus being an executive. But yes, absolutely. Some of this plays into how Kamala Harris's campaign thinks about, operates, with the awareness about the history-making aspects of her campaign, and honestly, why she basically lets it speak for itself in her presentation as a woman of color, and doesn't actually talk about it herself, and doesn't emphasize it herself.
Exactly. And I want to get more into that too, but I also wanted to ask you, Amanda, just on the flip side, the parts of this poll, show the country is more ready for a woman president than 8 years ago. So progress, there is some, optimism here too. What do you see, and can you talk more about the difference between now and 2016 in that respect?
Well, I think this is so interesting, especially when you look at it through the lens of women voters, because
Yeah.
we've seen women live through so much in the last 8 years. When you think about the first Women's March and all of the activism and outpouring that we saw, the Me Too movement, then women being disproportionately affected during the pandemic, the childcare crisis, the economy disproportionately affecting women as well. And we've seen in this polling consistently for several years, women have reported their mental health has suffered, they're stressed out about the economy. And so I think that all of those things have really changed women's perception. I think the rose colored glasses were off that were on in 2016 in, playing fight song and being excited about having women on stage, which was a moment. And now I think that women are a lot more clear-eyed about the challenges and hurdles and even the conversations that we've seen around electability and around bias, I think are a good sign that those behaviors are being questioned. And so I think it's definitely still not a cakewalk as we've seen, but I think that people are more likely to set aside her gender and to look at the state of the economy and the issues because of where the country is. And I think that that's also a sign of progress too.
Mhm. Elena, I mean, you alluded to this too about, Kamala Harris not doing so much of the I'm going to break the glass ceiling like we heard Hillary in 2016. Is that significant, like a different track that she's trying to do this time than the kind of rhetoric that we heard from Hillary Clinton around gender?
Yeah, she's really diverged from Hillary Clinton's playbook that she used in 2016. I mean, going back and just even watching the DNC and some of the moments, there was a visual in which they showed it back in 2016. Every single one of the 45 president or 44 presidents up until that point, man after man after man after man after man, and then the sound of glass breaking, and then Hillary Clinton's face popping up on the screen. I mean, you don't get more literal than that, except maybe the Javits Center that also had a glass ceiling in New York City for election night. So yeah, they very much thought that this was, and even having talked to some of Hillary Clinton's former aides, I think that there was an awareness that this is something they wanted to lean into, was something that was important and personally important to Hillary Clinton, sort of coming out of second wave feminism, of leaning into this concept of what feminism meant, but then also needing to honestly differentiate herself from the other Clinton, who was a dude, who was a guy. That there was some real need to lean into her gender because of those factors. And Kamala Harris is, has the benefit of having watched that not work for Hillary Clinton and deciding to take, in some ways, borrow a little bit more from the Obama playbook, which was, he did very notably and historically talk about his race in a speech in Philadelphia when during the whole Jeremiah Wright, who was
because he had to.
Exactly, where he was really forced to into talking about his race. And so it's not to say that he ignored it completely by any means, but he really did not lean into it or emphasize it in his presidential run in 2008. And I think in a lot of ways, she's doing the same thing. She's letting her physical appearance speak for itself.
Yeah.
And she is not trying to say that she's going to be making history. And in her own convention, again, she wore navy. And all the women, so many of the women in Chicago were wearing white on the night that she accepted her convention speech, or accepted the nomination, but she chose to wear navy. And I think, again, it was even in her speech, a lot of what she talked about was really about asserting strength and power and using a lot of that very sort of, what we imagine as traditionally male-dominated language and spaces, and not leaning so much into, again, the gender or her own story. I mean, she did to a degree, but not as a means to sort of be the reason why you should vote for her.
It was more of a biography, like, let me tell you who I am, versus
exactly.
the glass ceiling.
So and that was really intentional. I think that there was really a decision that this is, this is, I had one woman put it to me this way, that she, I think it was an activist out in Georgia who talked about how, I've been the first Black woman in a whole lot of spaces, and I don't walk in there and say, hello, I'm the first Black woman to be here. And I think that there is something notable in sort of in choosing that strategy.
Yeah.
And just last point here, because I do think this is really interesting. Part of what I think has also helped her is the speed at which this has happened. I think
Mhm.
that if we had had an election for 2 years, and as
Totally.
a political
Yeah.
reporter, I can totally say this, I can imagine editors asking me over and over again, how is she talking about her gender? How is she talking about her race? By having this be a 3-month almost snap election,
Yeah.
we just haven't had the time to really even process it. And I think that that in some ways could work to her favor.
And
Yeah,
I
and
just want to
even
jump
thinking
in.
back in 2020, we had a lot of the women run. It was a discussion in primary debates,
Mm-hmm. Yep,
memorably.
exactly.
But I know, Amanda, you guys have done a lot of research on this sort of glass ceiling, talking too much about it. Why is that doesn't resonate? Why is that can be a hindrance in a campaign?
Well, I was also really
Yeah.
struck too by Elena's point about the
Yeah.
timeline, because
Uh-huh.
related to that, one thing we've been talking about is that Barbara always says for women, ambition can be a 4-letter word. And
Mhm.
so by kind of stepping up and becoming the candidate when Joe Biden stepped down, the vice president
Mhm.
wasn't saying, I want to be president for myself. She was sort of doing a duty and stepping
That's a
into
good
a
point.
role. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a lot more palatable for people than if she came straight out of the Senate and said that she wanted to be president. I think a
Yep.
lot of the backlash that we see against women, and we saw in the 2020 primary, Elena, against those 4 women senators, was the ambition backlash. Who does she think she is? She doesn't have
Exactly.
enough experience. So I
Yeah.
think that that's part of it. And then we've also seen, and I think the campaign's done a great job with this, and I bet Lindsay's seen this too in recent years, that voters are just, they feel like they've been through so many crises that they really just want messaging framed around them. They want to know what politicians are going to do for them. And if you don't frame language around voters, then they just think that the politicians are doing things for their own goals. And so that's why I think that people can be cynical about glass ceiling language, because they're just trying to pay their rent. They don't really care if you're going to break a record by getting elected.
Yeah, very good points. I did want to just encourage anyone who has a question to please be sure to go ahead and submit that, because we'll take some questions. We have a few more minutes. And also wanted to remind everybody that the slides that we've shared are available in the chat. There's a link to our report, and you can click through and see our press release, the memo, and then the actual slides that we shared, if you would like any further information. I wanted to talk about Republican women on the question of how important it is to elect more women to political office. And we've seen this in other years, but our friends at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers, just who do a great job of kind of tracking who's running, what women are running for office at any given time, have kind of come out with a report that basically says, we're seeing Republican women falling behind in the number of candidates and nominations that we have going into the general election, that the numbers just aren't there. And the point being, hey, look, if we want to have gender parity, that it can't just be a one-sided situation. It can't just be among Democrats. I mean, we've got 126 members of Congress, Democratic, 126 women who are representatives in Congress, and only 34 of those, I think, are Republicans. And so I think this came into our question about how important it is to elect more women to political office. 89% of Democrats said, yes, that was very important or somewhat important. Only 46% of Republican women say that. And so it's easy to see that when you have essentially half of the women in a party saying, we're good, we don't need to elect more women in office, that doesn't encourage more women to actually run for office.
Yeah, I
Lindsay, do
think
you want
that's
to, or
right.
Amanda, weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've seen in our polling that Republicans in general and some independents are less likely to say that there needs to be more women, or even to acknowledge that gender is a factor. They tend to double down and say gender and race don't matter, when
Yeah.
then if you keep talking to them, it does. But I think another important point too about Republican women in this moment is that, and we're seeing this in the New Hampshire governor's race, that for some Republican women, they're in a really tough spot about abortion, being forced to defend a lot of other comments and extreme views that are coming from their party. And even
Mhm.
when you look at the Trump campaign and the comments that have been made about women in the last 6 months, the governor, the candidate for governor in New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte, a few years ago, I think, distanced herself from Trump and is now saying that she's going to vote for him, and is just sort of walking this fine line on that, and being very, very careful in her wording around abortion. And I think we saw Nikki Haley do a really effective job being very careful in her wording around abortion too. But I wouldn't be surprised if some women just don't want to deal with that pressure, especially in such high profile positions.
Yeah. And also we're going to see in the 2024 election so far, and Amanda, maybe you can give us a little, your insights into this too, but we're going to see, you mentioned New Hampshire, right? We'll definitely be adding a woman in that race. So, there are chances for other women to be elected, in governorships, of course, in the Senate, and a couple of House races. Do you want to go through any of those?
Yeah, I mean, there could really be a shift in the number of women governors. Definitely, like you said, in New Hampshire, there's two women running against each other. There's a few other races where women are viable candidates. And then, of course, if the vice president is elected, then Peggy Flanagan will become governor of Minnesota as well. And that's important because, as Elena was saying, there are still so few women governors in general. And Barbara, when she started this work, really focused on women governors because she saw that as a pipeline to the presidency. And now, of course, we see senators and others that are successful in jumping in, but it's still a very important pipeline for cabinet positions as well. So
Right.
we could see, if we add a few women to governorships, that would be transformational, since 12, which we have now, is the all-time high for women governors in the country. And then in the Senate, we have LaFonza Butler from California is obviously stepping back, but there is a good chance that we will add at least one Black woman to the Senate, Angela Alsobrooks and/or Lisa Blunt Rochester. So we're also watching those races very closely as well. So it will definitely be a nail biter of a week, but exciting potential down ballot as well.
And I noticed when we were thinking about cabinet members too, the question is, if Kamala Harris, if she wins, will she appoint a Republican to the cabinet? And then would that Republican happen to be Liz Cheney? She kind of dodged that question, but we'll see. Lindsay, let me ask you before we go. Obviously, a poll is just a snapshot in time, but as a pollster, what are you looking for? Are there any particular questions that, as we look to kind of read the tea leaves and see what's going to happen in 26 days, are there particular questions beyond the obvious horse race question that you would, as a pollster, kind of keep your eye on?
Certainly the economy, as we've seen Kamala Harris eat away at Trump's lead on the economy in these swing states, that is a key indicator for us. But I think 26 days out, a lot of this is sort of in the hands of the universe at this point. What are the crises that are coming up? How will the hurricane affect voting and voters, and how the administration handles it? I think there's, everybody's sort of waiting to see what the next October surprise could be. So I think a lot of it, just in terms of a pollster, but like also the rest of us, we're just waiting to see what the universe provides.
And what about you, Elena, in terms of your reporting and what you're covering? What are you paying attention to in the last weeks here?
Oh, that's a great question. It feels a bit like this is like the flying blind period where we're just sort of like anxiously going through our calendar of how many more days do we have left. Look, I think I'm going to keep watching where the enthusiasm level is. I think that that's going to be really a good indicator as to who's going to show up. As lame of an answer as that is, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of open questions as to who will make up this electorate. how big that gender gap really is could prove pivotal for her. And I think that the level of enthusiasm that we see on both sides is going to answer a lot of questions as to where this goes.
Yeah. I do want to let everybody know about some upcoming events that we have. Next Wednesday, we are doing an in-person event at American University, screening a great new documentary called Shaking It Up, The Life and Times of Liz Carpenter, who was, of course, noted journalist, press secretary to Lady Bird Johnson, and her daughter, Christy Carpenter, along with Abby Ginsburg, are the
I think we lost Betsy, but I know that we just threw a link in the chat for that event, so folks can sign on the link and sign up, as well as check out other events that are going to be happening. They have really great programming here for Women on Wednesdays, and I know that Betsy has some really great programming coming up in the coming weeks. So I'm sure she will be. Here she comes.
Froze. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I don't know where I froze off. But you can find all the info on our events on our website. So we hope you all will come visit us the next 2 weeks. And I want to thank Amanda and Elena and Lindsay so much for contributing to this poll and their reporting on the poll, Elena, and for sharing their insights with us tonight. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.